So thank you all for being here. This panel presentation is a joint effort between the library's lecture committee. So we try and do several lectures each year on various topics. But it was sort of informed by the fact that the library this year is in partnership with the Forsyth County Public Library in their community reading program. And some of you guys may have had community reading programs in other cities, but it's where county picks a single book and then they organize events. And this year, Forsyth County Public Library, along with us and other libraries, applied for a National Endowment of the Arts Big Read grant, and we got approved for that. And so, as part of that, we were a contributing partner to the grant, and we agreed to host this and on the bookmark in your book, 2 other events. In this room next Tuesday night at 7 p.m., we're going to do just a general book discussion about Fahrenheit 451. So it's going to be led by Tim Blackburn, who is the husband of Jessica Richard in the English department, and he has taught Fahrenheit 451 many times to many different types of audiences. And it's going to be really completely informal, just come and discuss the book. He's got some questions, but the discussion can go however we decide we want it to go. And then a week from this coming Sunday, on October the 12th at 3 p.m. in Annenberg Forum in Carswell Hall, we're excited to be able to bring in the biographer of Ray Bradbury, who wrote the Bradbury Chronicles in 2005. And actually, I was just talking to him last week. He just got back. He visits Bradbury very often. It was an authorized biography of Bradbury. And so from what I hear, because he does this for a lot of his big read programs, he's an incredibly entertaining and engaging speaker, and there'll be refreshments after that. And his book, Bradbury Chronicles, will be for sale and all of that. So I hope you guys can join me for those. We'll have flyers up around campus about both of those. But book discussion here next Tuesday night, and then Sunday the 12th at 3 p.m. in Annenberg Forum, we will have the Sam Weller lecture. Those of you who haven't gotten a book, pick one up on your way out. Our director, Lynn Sutton, has very graciously purchased and allowed us to give away for free 1,500. This is the end of 1,500 copies of Fahrenheit 451. So it's been great to see students and faculty and community members alike walk by the table and go, really? Really? I love this book. And they'll hand it to a friend. Have you read this book here? You've got to read this book. So as most of you, if you've read it again recently, it's a particularly prophetic book. We are also in the middle of Banned Books Week, which is something that the American Library Association, I hate to say celebrates. It's something that they recognize every year as an issue. So we have invited 3 faculty members from Wake Forest to sort of discuss in their own way issues of censorship, banning, why books have such a power, why as a society we keep coming back to this idea of the power of the book. So we're going to start with John Llewellyn from the Communication Department, and we'll have Ryan Bowie from the English Department, and Dr. Andrew Etten as well from the English Department. And I will let them sort of do that, and then at the end I hope we'll have an engaging discussion and back and forth and all of that sort of thing, and a peppermint patties at the end. So thank you very much, and take it away.
Well, I appreciate this opportunity. I very much appreciate you being here. I look much more forward to hearing what you have to say. I know what I have to say. I'm kind of going to need to redeem that. I've reached the point in my life where I can either look at you or read, but not both. Until I break a leg, I'm not going to bifocal. So if I seem to be back, I really do know you're there and I care, but in order to get the words to you, I may fake it once in a while. In accepting the 1950 Nobel Prize for Literature, William Faulkner gave a brief speech, 554 words and 39 lines. It is ranked with the remarks of presidents and civil rights leaders in the top 100 American speeches of the 20th century. This speech holds its high station because Faulkner spoke important truth that bears repeating when we consider the issue of banning books. He said, and I quote, "I decline to accept the end of man. It is easy enough to say that man is immortal simply because he will endure. That when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, that even then there will still be one more sound, that of his puny, inexhaustible voice still talking. I refuse to accept this. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance." Faulkner goes on to say that the writer reminds the individual, quote, "of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. And thus the writer provides the, quote, pillars to help him endure and prevail. I come to you today to support the contention that I believe all information provides pillars for mankind to prevail." I come to the issue of book burning and censorship generally from this humanistic perspective. The free exchange of ideas is essential to individual fulfillment and social advancement. I should add that I was raised in university libraries as my mother pursued her undergraduate and graduate degrees. I had the run of the acquisitions department before I could spell the name on the door. And it was a wonderful time. The premise of censorship is that there is some information that you can't handle. That knowledge would be dangerous or destabilizing, and so it is withheld from you. If that information is the classic example, when troop ships are sailing, the need for secrecy is self-evident. However, censorship is not only about the claims of necessity, it also creates advantages and opportunities for some parties. As Mae West, the femme fatale of the 1930s and 40s movies, proclaimed, "I believe in censorship. I made a fortune out of it." She summed up her career meteorologically. "I used to be Snow White, but I drifted." Not all censorship is lighthearted. Today's students have grown to maturity with a federal ban on the filming of military coffins returning from the Middle East to Andrews Air Force Base. That censorship serves only to save the government embarrassment and to deny the media the recurring images that help to make our losses palpable. Oscar Wilde offers a summary judgment here. He uses books, but I will say books and images. The books and images that the world calls immoral are the books and images that show the world its own shame. I should admit an alarming act. I banned Fahrenheit 451. I was not the first, to be sure, but I chose to wait 50-plus years before reading this classic because I imagined it to be science fiction, and I don't like science fiction. The larger point here is that no one can ban books better than you can. When you don't know or don't care or decline to even crack the book, as I did, no one else need ban it. You've done the job yourself. We should pay attention to state action in banning books. But as Ray Bradbury has observed, quote, "You don't have to burn books to destroy a culture. Just get people to stop reading them," close quote. A passage on page 12 of Fahrenheit 451 made me think Bradbury had time traveled to a modern campus, perhaps even this one. He writes of Montag's wife, Mildred, "And in her ears, the little seashells, the thimble radios tamped tight, and an electronic ocean of sound, of music and talk coming in on the shore of her unsleeping mind." Do we now have the time and attention for books, or even for each other? Is it not the case now that we are so iPodded, Twittered, and cell phoned that a student could go an entire day on campus without speaking to another flesh and blood human being? Do we read anything that was not written by thumbs? That's a generational joke, but it'll work. A quick Lexis search of the 100 most recent newspaper articles on banned books finds some activity in the U.S., but the bulk of banning is found in Australia, China, Iran, Malaysia, New Zealand, Pakistan, and Russia. Harry Potter tops the list of contested titles in the U.S., along with many perennial classics. What is Potter's sin? Of course, there's the witchcraft and sorcery, but the broader complaint is that Rowling's books, quote, "model disrespect of adults," close quote, disrespect for adults, close quote, as though adolescents need any help coming to In the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that our license plate reads Harry Potter, if you've ever seen our car. When we talk about censorship, we're really talking about our relationship to authority. Someone more powerful than we are tells us we cannot know or see something and justifies that ruling from a position of power. This use of power is often coercive. Say, for example, the newly elected mayor of your small town in Alaska quizzes you, the librarian, on how books are banned, and when you demur, threatens to fire you for not providing, quote, "full support," close quote. Just hypothetical. Ripped from today's headlines, same thing. Confronting such actions requires gumption. Most of our education has been in the inculcation of obedience. You can cut so many classes, show up here for the exam, etc. But real education is learning to think and stand up for yourself. Despite the rise of Yell TV behaviors, standing up for oneself need not involve aggression or haranguing. It can involve reasoned discourse and argument about societal values and the proper role of government. Justice Potter Stewart sums up, quote, "Censorship reflects society's lack of confidence in itself. It is a hallmark of an authoritarian regime," close quote. The most biting antidote to censorship is ridicule. Tyrants and tyrant wannabes can take frontal assaults, but are helpless against the likes of Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, Mark Twain, George Carlin, Sam Kinison, Bill Hicks, Chris Rock, and the Monty Python troupe. There's only one problem. All but the last two in that series are dead. Granted, their legacy lives on, and even in death, they're wittier than those they critique. But it does seem wiser to have living analysts. Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert are living antidotes to censorship in our media age. The epitome of ridicule overcoming censorship is found in the work of the late George Carlin. I trust all of you are familiar with his routine, 7 words you can't say on television. In the spirit of Banned Books Week, I'd like to share them with you now. Just kidding. But you know what I mean. Let me conclude with 2 brief points. The first is, what are we doing here today? You may have asked yourself as I was speaking. In my discipline, this activity is called epideictic rhetoric. That is, rhetoric of praise and blame. We are talking about and holding up to scrutiny the values of free inquiry and the perils of censorship. Why is there a Banned Books Week? Because we want to see as little as possible of this impulse in the other 51 weeks. This event on our campus and across the country is a public relations effort in support of an idea. The purpose is to remind us of these values before the censor comes calling. The belief that there are ideas that authorities should protect you from knowing is perennial. This session invites advocacy and discussion to inoculate us against such protection. But public relations is not a benign instrument. In 1962, Silent Spring caught the corporate world flat-footed and spawned the environmental movement. Since that time, modern PR firms have learned to conduct campaigns to suppress books that offend their clients' interests. This suppression happens through threats of legal action, pressure to reduce press runs and cut publicity budgets, the use of corporate spies posing as volunteers, and dirty tricks to disrupt media coverage of the offending ideas. So what does the future hold? The recent behavior of the Chinese authorities during the Summer Olympics should give us pause. All that glitters is not free speech, and even authoritarians can put on impressive ceremonies, regardless of who is actually singing. Censorship is a mischief that is always looking for an opening. In our society, the climate of public opinion will determine how energetic the censors will be. It may be that the biggest player in the censorship question will be our friend the Internet. The decentralized structure and anyone can participate phenomenon may make large-scale censorship increasingly difficult. This structure levels the playing field and gives small actors leverage against great wealth and institutional power. Perhaps the Internet will become the marketplace of ideas. It is inevitable that this marketplace will bring us offshore poker sites and spam and allegedly adult material. It seems only fair that truly positive human values, like freedom of inquiry, should be reinforced as well. Yale University president and historian Alfred Griswold deserves the final word. Books don't stay banned. They won't burn. Ideas won't go to jail. In the long run of history, the censor and the inquisitor have always lost. The only weapon against bad ideas is better ideas.
Well, I'd like to thank my colleague, John Willen, for his wonderful start to this. I actually focus on an aspect that he's already talked about, and that is this idea of more than one way to burn a book. And what I want to do is to start with a quote from another work that helped me to kind of frame my thoughts for today. To make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one. You must be able to detect no inconsistencies. The man that takes his earnings must be able to convince him that he has a perfect right to do so. The whole relationship must not only demonstrate to his mind its necessity, but its absolute rightfulness. Those lines were taken from Frederick Douglass's 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. And according to Douglass, one of the things that he notes is, with the slightest crevice that allows for this tiny drop, the slave's chains will fall away. And I found that interesting because what the autobiography chronicles is his journey to freedom. And what it implicitly argues is that literacy is an important step, but literacy alone will not, just the ability to read alone will not necessarily grant freedom. That literacy must be backed up by this overriding or underlying question of why. And such a simple word, but the power of that word rests in many ways with my takeaway from Fahrenheit 451. And what's interesting is that in the book, the possession of books or the acquisition of letters as they appear has to, at least the way that Bradbury seems to situate it, be empowered by an intellectual curiosity, or even more importantly, as Clarice notes, as we're told about Clarice, a gentle hunger to know. Thus, it is uninspiring to discover that it is unsurprising to discover that in the afterwards of Fahrenheit 451, Montauk locates Beatty's massive collection of books. The fire chief, the man who, of course, took savage glee in burning others' books, owned but never read the ones that he possessed. The possession then, as he observes, poses little threat. Reading and reading critically is what ultimately threatens by creating an ambiguity and authorizing a multiplicity of voices in social issues, thereby opening the floodgates to questions of why with resonances that, if we're thinking even now in our own particular moment, we can wrap our minds around. Certainly questions of why we have nooses in the 21st century swinging on professors' doors, or why one of our presidential candidates at a forum co-sponsored by Focus on the Family had a pancake box, like a waffle mix box with his photograph on the front of it. Those are the histories that if we don't have a context, if we're not reading critically, if we're not tapping into the information that's available, we don't have a way of explaining or understanding where the roots of those particular problems. But what becomes interesting for me is Beatty's power to possess and, of course, suppress such questions exists within his ability to silence the book by literally eradicating it in his act of burning, or by hiding it from others. As he notes to Montauk, don't you see the beauty? I never read them. Not one book, not one chapter, not one page. Thus, a book without a reader or a translator has no power. And of course, as my colleague Andrew notes in his Q&A, one of the things about that is we have to ask the question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? And so, in the case of Beatty, this hidden archive reminds us on one level of Bradbury's warning that there's more than one way to burn a book. Most of our authentic lessons about the power of the book come from Faber, our, of course, aged English professor who at varying junctures seems to kind of walk between nihilism and revolution. He is, of course, the one who identifies the book as the everything and the nothing when he observes to Montauk that change does not necessarily require books per se, because books are just the mere receptacles. They allow us to retain the information which we are most afraid to forget. But the real magic of the book exists in not only exists in what the books say, but also how they stitch together the patterns of our universe. The magic, once again, becomes contingent upon the seemingly simple question that we must raise as to why, and its necessity and the necessary complement of remembering. This, of course, we learned very early on from the figure of Clarice, who, with all of her youthful wisdom, has already learned part of the lesson. Of course, not from books, and it becomes interesting once again that books, which are central to this discussion and central to the book, aren't necessarily central to the transmission of knowledge. What Clarice gets, in many ways, comes from orality, the passing down of information from her family and her associates, and then her act of passing that on orally to Montauk, who then is ultimately able to liberate himself from those ideologically controlled narratives of how things had, quote unquote, always been. And by the end of the novel, he locates, of course, a community of people, fugitives like himself, embodying, literally in some ways, the memory of the books. People like Granger, who, of course, are reading and memorializing and retelling it, and even, dare I say it, burning the books. Because, as they note, as we're constantly reminded, there's more than one way to burn a book, but there's also more than one way to remember and to pass on the legacy of the books. In this case, the narrative finds a new stability in human memory. Ironically, aside from various hidden archives, the state-sanctioned books, like, of course, the Fireman's Rule Book, present us with a grand testament of the potential fallibility of an unquestioned book. What the Fireman embraces is a history founded upon an original fiction about the way things had, of course, always been. A reality that Montauk, in that moment, understood to be the to be a great narrative fiction set forth as truth. So this gets us to an interesting point. If the book is subject to human manipulation, then of course why read, why remember, why preserve? And of course Bradbury does, I think, a very nice job of answering that question. When the book is central and the book has to be authored in ways that are true to the author. It is not necessarily up to the publishing industry to censor, it's not up to the reader to necessarily understand every aspect of the book, but it's up to us to then read it and to think critically about it and to question why. And to, from there, move forward. And I want to kind of go back to Douglass for a moment, because what's interesting is, of course, in the autobiography that I cite, My Bondage and My Freedom, the book becomes his personal and political liberation. What's interesting about that narrative is it's his second one. It's his break from Garrisonian abolition. It's the one where he argues that he had to leave Garrison's control and this kind of abolitionist control because he was writing and thinking as an individual and as a man. And in that way, he had to then become the author of his own words and the agent of those words. So he shuffles off, as he suggests, his moral indignation, and he rejects attempts by Garrison's abolitionist network to their suggestions that he add a little more plantation in his voice. And rather, what he does is create an autonomy for himself, like a mechanism for constituting the self, but also a political platform that we know becomes hugely influential and inspirational in the 1850s. So it becomes interesting in that sense that we have our Douglass, but part of where I want to go, and this is where I'm going to kind of talk a little bit off the cuff and hopefully make some sense. And that is, for every Douglass, every My Bondage and My Freedom, we have books like the fictive one, there are Little Black Sambo, or the Uncle Tom's Cabin, some book that people aren't going to like, that people aren't going to read or want to somehow trouble or to think about critically. And of course, what do you do with that, with those moments? In the novel, of course, the people willingly hand over their agency. They would rather burn or ban or flee from a book that makes them feel uncomfortable, that makes them think critically. I want to argue something differently. And of course, we all know that African American history and most people's histories are charged with so many different possible interpretations and problems. Like, how do you, and it becomes a question of what should you teach? How do you approach the idea of teaching the material? And one of the things that I would say is, I think there are very few limitations to how you teach it. I personally, and I looked at the list of banned books and I found myself somewhat amused by a number of the books on the list, certainly The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because on the one hand, I teach Huckleberry Finn and Benito Cereno and works of that kind, in part because they stage the ambiguity of discussions about race. They force a confrontation. They force you to raise the question of why, even if they don't necessarily answer that question. I teach The Bluest Eye and Beloved, even though those books raise very troubling and problematic questions about motherhood and love and black identity in the public sphere. But I also, at the same time, am vastly invested in teaching works like The Klansman or Birth of a Nation, which offer this counter perspective. They're the roots of many of the responses that you see in black and in African American literature. And so it becomes important to give the whole picture. There isn't, to my thinking, a book that should ever be fully banned, but rather books that need to be taught to help establish a context and a much longer bent for how we read our own cultural moments in the present. So with that said, I just want to kind of reiterate this idea, and that my takeaway from this book is that there is only one way to, there's more than one way to burn a book. And the ultimate fallibility is in the forgetting.
So remembering is obviously a crucial idea in this text. And I think because I felt so warmly toward the film of Fahrenheit 451, which I saw before I ever read the book. I could have read the book before, but I happened to see the film first, many years ago, and It is, in its own way, a lovely film, though different from the book in significant ways. I think because of that memory, I didn't want to plunge right back into reading Fahrenheit 451 immediately. Instead, I read the material at the end of the book. The coda, the afterword, the interview with Ray Bradbury, and found myself placing those works, and therefore also Fahrenheit 451, within a historical context. If you read the coda, and I do encourage you to read it because it's curious. It's a curious piece of work. You will find it to be, I think, cranky and edgy, filled with complaints about special interest minority groups who demand the rewriting of his work and demand that things be changed because they were not included or because they were portrayed in ways that were not very friendly. So I was interested to see when he wrote that coda. It was 1979. Don't know whether it was written the same year that it was printed, but it came out in 1979. Unlike most of the people in this room, I was around in 1979. And I was, in fact, even in Winston-Salem and at Wake Forest in 1979. Well, you know, in 1979, there was a lot of what I will call censorship by omission. At that time, the English department, for its courses in British and American literature, had an approved list of writers who could be taught in those courses. The only writers who could be taught in British literature, for example, who were also women, were, I think, George Eliot and maybe Virginia Woolf. In American literature, the writers of color were Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, and that was it. You didn't have to burn the other books, you simply leave them out of the canon. They don't have to be acknowledged, they don't have to be recognized, they don't have to be dealt with, and therefore the experiences of people represented by their unread books will be erased from the canon. I reflected upon my own school years, my own education, where when I thought about it, going to a public university in a populous mid-Atlantic state, I took courses in world history where African history appeared only apropos of colonialism, and where the history of my people, the Jewish people, which you might think to be fairly integral to world history, appeared mostly in the context of conquest by the Roman Empire and the Holocaust. And that was pretty much it. You know, that basically was what Jewish history represented. So if you're thinking of what we remember, you have to ask first, well, what is it that we have the possibility of remembering? What can we be introduced to that we might remember? I grew up in a household, unlike yours, I grew up in a household in which no one had been to college. No one had the opportunity to go to college. But the house was filled with books. Prime candidate for the torch, for the salamander, our house was. In fact, it was probably a candidate for spontaneous combustion when I think about some of those old books lying around. There were famous books. There were not so famous books, there were good books, there were not so good books. There were books of poetry, there were books of fiction, there were books of nonfiction. They were an essential component to my education beyond anything that I was getting in school, and frequently very different from anything that I was getting in school. They included history, but they also included the reaches of the human imagination. Here's how people can imagine living. Here is how people can see the world. There were some factual books, so-called, of history or pseudo-history, and I remember with some amusement some books of what I would now term pseudoscience, to which my mother pointed me as a substitute for the talk about the birds and the bees. And if I think of one book that I might, in a rash moment, put forward as a candidate for book burning, it seems to me that it was a very misguided sex education book in the house that dated from sometime very early in the 20th century and suggested that terrible and irremediable things would happen to you if you ever masturbated. And I thought that was probably not a healthy book to have around or to pass on to anybody else. But it was there, and it was simply part of the sort of entry into the mix, along with lots of other more interesting and better informed books that were much more useful to me in my life. So, what is it that keeps us coming back to the written text? I think one of them is the pleasure of recreating the experience of reading. The book becomes a friend that you can revisit. That bit of conversation that you wish you could recall, and you go back and you read it, and yes, it has that same texture again. I was so pleased in returning to Fahrenheit 451 after truly decades. We won't go into how many decades, but many, to realize how good Ray Bradbury's prose is. Frequently lyrical, always, or almost always concise, very much to the point. I liked having that visit with him once again, to hearing the sounds of voice, to get back to some of those scenes that were so touching, so gripping, and to know that I might change. The world certainly does change. I will hear new nuances in those conversations. But there is the human being alive, in a way for all eternity, but in a way also caught in a moment of time, caught in that period in 1953, where in the schools that I attended, we did have atomic bomb drills. We did go out in the halls and cover our heads and necks in the hope that when the ceiling fell on us from the explosion of the nuclear weapon on Manhattan, which was not all that many miles away, we would be sufficiently protected. So the apocalyptic scene that takes place in this book is one that is very much of the historical period. And yet, I could also read that and say, well, didn't happen like that back then. We might be beyond that now. But still, don't we carry around with us this possibility that if everything were flattened, we could find something, some text, some word that would help us start all over again? What's the word that we would need? What's the text that could give people hope and possibility? I think maybe that's why John Milton, 3.5 centuries ago, in Areopagitica, wrote, "As good kill a human being," he said man, actually, I'll edit that, I don't care. As good kill a human being as kill a book. It's not much difference between the two, because the book becomes the very embodiment of all that the human being is, all that the human being fears and hopes and longs for, and is willing to risk a life for, or for that matter, to take a life for. And maybe if we don't get anything else specific from this particular book, perhaps that's what we should take away from it. The challenge to ask ourselves, each of us, what would I give my life for? What would I take a life to preserve, if anything? Is the life worth more than the book? You call me that.
Now we can do questions if anyone has questions on any sort of the Fahrenheit 451 related observations about the book.
The quotation from Milton,
Yeah.
what prompted him to say that? I mean, what about the situation?
Yeah, this was in the 1640s. Parliament, English Parliament, had passed a law requiring the pre-publication licensing of books. That was a way of censoring the books before they came out. And Milton, though he's often represented as taking a sort of absolutist free speech, liberty of publication position, that's not quite accurate. Milton says that if we believe that a book can do good, and he does believe that books can do good, he said then we also have to believe that a book can do harm. But you have to try it first and convict it. You can't decide ahead of time that is a bad book and nobody can be allowed to read it. So he says, any kind of pre-publication censorship is going to have a chilling effect on writers as well as on readers. Because if you cannot write with a sense of authority, then there's no point in writing at all. If you can't write as if you feel you were completely in command of what you want to say. So his argument is put forth as if it were a speech to Parliament. If I could speak to Parliament, this is what I would say. And in that pretend speech called Areopagitica, he makes that claim that we have to come to understand truth through the contest of contrary ideas. And once you prevent people from engaging that way, you have killed an idea, and therefore you have killed everything that the author stands for. You have destroyed that person by saying your ideas are not even fit to be entered into the public discourse.
I haven't read the book or seen the movie, but what happened in Bradbury's life prompted him to write that book in 1953? Is there any specific thing?
I'm not sure about what happened in his life. I mean,
That would be the question to bring to Sam Weller's lecture. It's better if we ever have Bradbury's biographer here on
Did
campus.
you?
So he could probably tell, he probably will tell us actually.
Well, he writes at some point about about the needing to be able to write and the sort of a burning desire, how that matched up with this storyline. I wouldn't say driven, but he certainly was impelled.
He also talks about publishing an earlier version in Galaxy
Yeah,
and then
right.
trying to get it published and having to, I think, wrangle with publishers and having to defend the merits of certain points that he wanted to include. So I got the sense from some interviews that there was also a general frustration. in some ways.
Yeah, I think. I think chilly climate would be the way of describing the attitude toward general intellectual discourse in the early 1950s. I think as much as anything else, he's responding to that, a feeling that there was a sort of cultural dumbing down, particularly, though not exclusively, in American life and culture at that time.
Just the cultural dumbing down. You said something about the exchange of free ideas and the idea of censorship by omission, which to me is really intriguing. And it connects to some idea, and I wanted to maybe get your sense of this, but is there maybe a sort of specificity to the academic, maybe as a kind of a community of practice where questions can be more critical, more exacting, more exploratory than... here's my example, is just being obsessed lately with this bailout thing. And I'm watching how it's gone from bailout to rescue in the media. And so I have this idea that Web 2.0 could be, maybe more, there's something sort of democratizing about the internet. But on the other hand, I'm seeing the way search engines are gummed up. By a media that answers to its sponsors. And so as a kind of counterbalance, I'm interested in the idea, if it's possible or if it's kind of hopeful or idealistic, if there is some kind of specificity to what we do, as academics, if there's some way to maybe disseminate that work or, some kind of counter to the way information is, information in print is brought to us.
There's always a struggle of trying to bridge the gap between academic understanding. I mean, you see this in the scientific world as well, with popular arguments over whether evolution is merely a theory. Trying to get through to the public discourse on something as basic and central as that suggests to me the difficulty of communicating on a reasonably sophisticated level about anything else. I think we keep trying. I really do, Judy. But how we go about doing it, I don't know. I'm not a blogger myself.
It seems like a question of authority, of authorship. How you talked about Milton, and I don't have an answer. I guess I'm just wondering.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is, just your observation about bailout to rescue, it had not registered in my head, and I thought, A, how insightful, and B, as somebody somewhere who's got some skill with symbols has been trying to figure out how do we step back from the brink, given the level of angst that the first term created. Yeah. I think that in itself is an interesting observation that an op-ed. You could do a quick word. How you would get some data behind it would be actually pretty easy. To me, the challenge is always, and I worked in government and PR and committed some of the sins I'm now trying to, if not undo, at least offset, is,
how do we find the vocabulary and the sort of the right focal length to step outside of our area of incredible expertise and say something that still is valid, but that is that somebody else can get without having to spend 6 years in a library to do it. And that's I mean, to me, the best example is psychology today, where I mean, some people say, well, it's so, but people get it, and that shouldn't be a bad thing. I think really smart people can write in ways that other people can get. Maybe you can't parse the very last idea, but it's an ongoing challenge, I think. And blogging, for those that are of a generation and have enough keyboard skills, is probably one way. But I think your observation is a good one. And I'd write an op-ed and send it to the Winston-Salem Journal, or someplace, and get the conversation started.
One of the things that, I haven't read this since I was 14 or something, but in thinking about it again now from the point of view of someone who tries to teach literature, what strikes me is there's something, it seems kind of odd about trying to encourage readers to feel good about the project of reading. And one reason I'm bringing that up is kind of to go to something that Ryan was saying about getting a larger context for foregrounding some of the critical questions you want to do when you talk about books. It seems to me one of the contexts for books, thinking about the history of books, right, is the repression that the book has to do explicitly of oral cultures, right? So the very existence of the book depends on some kind of outright cultural banning, as it happens in the case of American history. So what colonists are doing when they're writing stuff down is not just writing stuff down. They're consolidating a cultural identity around a print technology with the explicit intent of delineating one group from another and marginalizing that other group. So when we talk about the history of the book, I mean, what do we do with that kind of piece of it that to my memory of Fahrenheit 451, doesn't get asked, doesn't come to the foreground the way I think we would want it, the way we can do that now. And I wonder what other folks' thoughts are about that fact, that there has to be the cultural work of a book is, to a certain extent, to repress. That repression is part of what makes meaning possible, but on the book possible, right? So I'm just kind of throwing that out there, not to ban the book, but to question our predilection to praise it, maybe overpraise it, I don't know.
I think it's interesting, and just going back to something that Andrew said in his talk, and that is this idea that if you're reading just the kind of the interviews and the coda, and it's disturbing in some ways that kind of push back against minorities and women, and this idea that, well, if a woman wants to write a book, yeah, show hers after mine, feature hers after mine, and that's fine. And so there's something about free speech that's important and intrinsic there, but there's also something equally as troubling about the rejection of this idea that a work should strive to be more inclusive and should strive to understand or engage in a kind of longer conversation. What's interesting, and I don't quite know what to do with it, is there seem to be of two minds with Bradbury, and that, the coda, and then that later interview, much later in his life, where he's talking about war and strife. And one of the things that I found interesting that seems to run slightly counter, or at least in a different direction than the book, is the idea that you're never going to get to a point where books get completely banned, that books are, in a Bakhtinian sense, engaged in this kind of multiplicity of discourses. Like, there isn't a singular conversation, but like all these multi-referent parts. And in that sense, it becomes interesting to think about the message of the book in terms of both what it succeeds in doing, and that's prioritizing the idea of remembering and of thinking through ideas, but also in its failure to actually adequately, in some ways, address the broader implications of its own social moment in 1950s. And when you were talking about that, I couldn't help, when you asked that question, I couldn't help but think about race relations or gender struggles. At the particular moment that this book is being published, you have all of these political moments. I'm forgetting in terms of McCarthyism, but I think you've got the seeds of that brewing, if not already underway. And so oppression, just surrounding it, and yet it doesn't seem to ask that important question or beg that question in any kind of overt way, other than Beatty's references to, this moment where that people don't like ambiguity. Like that's the closest it seems to come to it, is this idea that people want something simple, easy, neat. They don't want anything that's going to question a worldview or push them to actually struggle over their own space in the universe and a particular place in the world. So.
But, for obvious reasons, we focus on the print culture, on the book as book. It will be interesting, particularly if you have not yet read the book or have not yet reread the book, to be aware of the degree to which Bradbury also acknowledges the importance of orality, of sheer people talking to one another, having conversations, transmitting stories that are passed on not through written texts, but by somebody remembering and telling tales about how it used to be when I was little or when I was growing up. And that's where I think maybe the importance of memory might even override the importance of the written account of memory in the book. And these are people who are, the people who survive are the ones who are memorizing books so that they can narrate them. And, at some future point, they can be written down.
That seems to be the conversion of books into bodies, which is the central symbology that the book is putting on. And that's not to say that this isn't true, but I think it seems to be part of the difficulty of the book is to talk about the very thing that makes the book possible. And I think that's so interesting, that it always winds up kind of reaffirming its own central, I might say, thesis. The burning of books is always prior to the burning of bodies. That's why books matter so much. Well, the writing of books was prior to the burning of bodies too. So you see what I'm saying?
I was recalling how powerful the images were to me of the Nazi book burning in the 1930s, which I don't know exactly how old Bradbury is.
He's 9. He just turned.
Oh, okay. So he's older than me.
Yeah.
So not much, but so for me, those were images in the history books, but relatively recent images, not that many years before me. For him, that was an experience that he lived through, to see the works of great writers, not only of his own day, but of previous eras, being cast into the flames because somebody decided that these writers had the wrong grandparents, or because the ideas in the books were not Aryan. Degenerate, yeah, they were degenerate. And I think that maybe for him, as a writer, was one of those trigger points.
Sort of changing the subject, John. I was interested in one of the things that you brought up because the internet's being near and dear to my heart and my everyday life. But that idea that some people have, and it's sort of a dichotomy, is the internet killing literacy? I mean, is it killing the book? Or is it the ultimate democratization of information, where what you said about China, which I watched with particular interest, this idea that we may not be far from the time when true censorship in a society is really possible, because of all of the people out there with their own cameras and their own keyboards and their own voices, you know, I mean, the crazy eye reports on CNN, and now New York Times is doing this, and in some ways it concerns me, and in other ways it kind of gives me hope when you talk about things about censorship and book banning and that sort of thing, that yes, maybe it'll be banned in China, but all they have to do is go into their computer and it's not banned elsewhere. And, you know, so I'm curious about your sorts of ideas about how sort of this democratization of technology or the internet, you know, may impact these sorts of ideas.
Well, elsewhere, I think I refer to it as whack-a-mole,
Right.
which I think
Right,
is,
that's a good
you know,
point.
you're going to get pornography, and you're going to get the fruit of the human spirit,
Right.
and that's good news and bad news, and there you are. I mean, I think ultimately, you know, then it will be back in our laps to figure out how we, you know, if we're starting a new day, kind of like the end of 451, how then do we do that? But I think the sort of the technology beats tyranny equation, even though technology has its own tyranny, the Mr. Luddites would argue for that, is, I think it's ultimately a good thing. It's probably ultimately an inevitable thing, so it's probably good that it's ultimately a good thing. But here we are with all of this freedom. What shall we make of it? And I think it's ultimately positive. Not that there won't be a lot of troubling stuff along the way, but you know, I think we are. I think it's sort of the fundamental thesis. I think we are ultimately trustworthy, and given sharper tools, may be able to make better decisions. That would be my bet.
It's hard to know how to come up with the sharper tools, though. You know, I was thinking about this in particular. A couple of hours ago, I'd gotten an email question from a graduate student. How do I follow up this particular idea and to find out more information about this topic? Well, I knew of a good out-of-print book that you know, was a possible source of information. And I thought, well, there must be something more easily accessible on the internet, because it wasn't that abstruse a topic. And I went looking, and the amount of sheer garbage that you would have to wade through before you found, you know, the one little nugget that was good was so oppressive. And not only that, I thought, in order to differentiate between the garbage and the good, you'd already have to know something. You know, if you're starting off absolutely green, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to figure out which was a reliable source and which was not. And that I suppose we'll figure out sooner or later, but I don't know exactly how one cultivates that.
I think they take Rouse's course.
Little plug.
Check is in the mail.
But I mean, it is a central theme of what we teach in all of the library instruction that we do, that how do you look at something when you don't have 6 years to get a PhD in a topic, right? How do you look at something, and what are the criteria you look at? And you know, the best thing to do, of course, is to start in a place where you know it's all scholarly, rather than in a place like the broad internet, where maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe, you know, Bob put up a fan page for Ray Bradbury, and somebody else was a world-renowned scholar, right? And people just make stuff up, and so just to sort of pick something that's already filtered that for you reliably from a reliable source. But that in some things, like this stock market issue right now, that, you know, the ultimate scholarly source hasn't been written yet, and so that becomes, you know, an even more troubling thing when when there's that sort of cacophony out there of information. And in 451, they sort of opt for the cacophony because they want people to be happy, right? They say just throw these, you know, room-sized television walls at people, and it will stop them from making those sort of critical judgments because they'll have so much information.
And meaningless data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the seashell thing. And I love that. It's sort of eerily prophetic, actually. It's like enormous, you know, wall-sized television screens, and that interactivity where they'll actually talk to you and use your name. And when you think about the sort of interactivity that's out there, it was really me, it was amazing. I read it in high school and then read it again over the summer, and it was just great. And my little highlighter, I was like,
This is crazy. Have you read the Proust and the Squid?
no.
Has anybody read that or looked at that?
The what?
Proust and the Squid. So
Lauren's been reading. Was it Lauren? It was
Yeah,
on
sorry,
sorry, back to the
yeah.
internet. It was on somebody's Goodreads feed the other day, yeah.
yeah, because she talks about the sort of the neurology and the biology of reading, and so she says reading a book creates one kind of brain, whereas reading, she's speculating, reading things online is going to create a different kind of brain. So have we handed over the evolution of the brain to Google as they download all these books to the internet? And I think that's why it feels like technology can be inevitable. You know, if we let it kind of build the brain that's going to fit with the object that the technology is creating. I don't know that it is necessarily inevitable, but I think that's another issue that, in a way, this story is trying to get us to think about too. It's like, what kinds of beings do we become
Right.
under these certain structures of communication of data or the absorption of data? And it does seem to be very much the case now that a new mode of transmission of data and absorbing data is literally going to reshape the human brain for the first time in history, independent of, we might say, biological process.
And there's some studies that are coming out that I've just read a couple synopses of that talk about how we read more text now than we ever have in
Right.
history. But it's almost all on the screen, and it's in very small bits. It's an email, it's a text message, it's an IM, it's your short news story, it's but all in all, we're reading more, but we're not reading the same kinds of things and in the same sort of patterns of the sit down with a good book. And now Borders is looking for a buyer. Did you hear that? That was the big news this morning. So I always use that thing, and here you have Borders doing really well, and so clearly books are not dead, but now Borders apparently. Maybe they even had a lot of bad debt or something. Maybe they made bad mortgage. the little known mortgage home buying.
Well, the old beer duality, less filling tastes great,
Right.
seems
Yeah.
to apply here. At least possible.
And I think what's interesting is something also gets lost in the browsing process. Like, I personally just love
right.
going in a bookstore or a library and just browsing the stacks.
The same thing
I
is
find that I discover things, or I find a book that I wasn't even looking for, that I must take this home and read it. And, that it fills in the gaps. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it helps to kind of fill in the gaps, and that is something that's lost when you're just searching these hyperlinks and you're going for the quick, the easiest, or even as much as I love the idea of the JSTORs and the
Right.
Project Muses, I find that in my classes I have to then force students to go into the library, and I've actually had occasions where students didn't actually know how to search stacks,
Right.
which is I think a troubling phenomenon in some ways, because we're so used to just finding information at our fingertips. I think this goes
Right.
to what you were saying, Rika, that this idea that there isn't more research beyond that. It's what I can find, let me see how it fits into what I'm writing, as opposed to the exactly done, finished, as opposed to the broader discovery process that is so much a part of looking at books and reading.
Yeah, and usually when I go into a bookstore looking for something specific, I always come out with something else. Yeah, then three or four something else. And same thing in the library. I think I'm looking for that particular book, and I discover, oh well, there are these 5 or 6 other books that
I've
also
been
got
meeting
to
with
have, right?
communication honors students, and that's one of the things that I've said. You don't, look in our catalog, find a couple of books that are good, and we're going to walk to the stacks, and you're going to look, and that's how I did for my thesis. I would just wander the Shakespeare stacks. Like,
Yeah, that's right.
let's see, and I probably got 80% of my research because, of course, I didn't have this many years ago.
If I might share something with everybody here, since it's current, I rescue, call it what you wish, is I'm a financial advisor, and I had lunch with somebody from Fidelity. Most people know the company Fidelity. He's an economist. And I asked him, how do they come up with the number 950 billion? Which
That was 700 million, but it grew.
950.
Yeah, it's a
They were asking why. They may have changed it since
They
they had to come up with a number, right? Well, that's the best estimate they have of the number of subprime mortgages today that are not being paid. And their idea is, very simply, since they're high single-digit mortgages, is to buy them at 1%, 2%, 3% and then sell them to other financial institutions for 6 or 7. And so the person's mortgage payment will come down, and the government, we, will make the money on that difference. God help us if it's true, to hope it works.
It's essentially short selling, that's how they're gonna make the money, is they're short selling the securities. Yeah. Buying low and selling.
No faith.
But they don't know how much of the bad debt is bad debt, so there's actually a chance part of it.
But only after that will they find out who's at fault.
That's right.
Right,
No,
that's right.
That they don't.
There's no way of knowing before.
Exactly.
We may get it all back, we may get
A fraction.
70% back, we may
And
get
Henry
40%
Paulson, the
back.
architect of this, I think that's.
Well, this man thinks that Paulson's a great man and very smart. I think he should lose his job.
He made hundreds of millions.
He was in on this alone.
Beg pardon?
He made hundreds of millions on Wall Street as a CEO executive, the executive of Goldman Sachs. So I kind of find it strange that he's going to tell us what's excessive payment, for a CEO.
Well, he should know.
Yeah.
Personal experience. Based on my personal experience,
It won't be a faculty member who tells.
Anything else? Well, thank you guys so much.